In this video, I want to try and describe to you what it takes to write a Christmas story. And in doing that, I'm going to use Frederick Forsyth's famous Christmas ghost story entitled The Shepherd. The Shepherd is one of the greatest British Christmas ghost stories since Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. Had an interesting origin story. What happened was that Freddie Forsyth had recently got married, and his young wife said to him, searching the house at Christmas for her Christmas present, "What have you got me for Christmas?" And he, having bought her a diamond ring, decided not to tell her, but to fib and say that he had, in all the rush of the move to Southern Ireland, that he had forgotten to get her anything. So she then said, "Well, write me a story for a Christmas present." And he said, "What kind of a story?" And she said, "Write me a Christmas ghost story." So he said, "All right." And he sat down on Christmas Eve, and I don't know, however many hours later, on the same day, he finished The Shepherd, which he then presented the next morning on Christmas Day to his wife, along with the diamond ring that he'd had all the time. So the story has a lovely origin to it, and it's an origin really about love. And I want to do a video at some point in the future on this, but I do believe we don't talk enough as authors and writers about love as a motivation for writing. But it clearly was for Freddie Forsyth in the writing of The Shepherd. Now, The Shepherd is about an RAF pilot in 1957 who on Christmas Eve is stationed at Celle Airport in Germany, and he is tasked to fly an RAF Vampire jet from Celle Airport, the 1-hour journey across the ocean to RAF Lakenheath in England. Unfortunately, as he crosses the shoreline to cross the ocean, all his electrics start misbehaving in the cockpit, and he finds himself flying blind. This is not helped by virtue of the fact that there's a very thick fog below, so he can't fly anymore by sight. He's really lost. His fuel is running out. He is literally all at sea. He is quite literally in a fog, and he's only now got minutes left to live. If he ditches in the sea, which is the most likely scenario, he's going to die very quickly because of the cold. And the story is really about how he is rescued by a pilot who functions as a shepherd. Now, in World War II, this was a common term. The shepherd was the pilot who very self-sacrificially, having flown a mission, would go back into the air, having refueled, to guide lost pilots home to the airfields of England, which is a case of really going the extra mile. Now, Forsyth uses this term, the shepherd, to create a quite breathtakingly brilliant and beautiful Christmas ghost story. And I think that The Shepherd provides us with 5 things that we absolutely should not do if we want to write a great Christmas story. None of these things Forsyth does himself, but in the brilliance of his storytelling, he shows us things that we definitely shouldn't do. The first thing I want to say, and I'm going to express these as 5 commandments from The Shepherd, and the first commandment is, "Thou shalt not be preachy." There's a terrible tendency in the Christian authors, mainly aspiring and inexperienced ones, who come to me at my company Book Lab for advice and coaching about how to reach the mass market with fiction. There's a terrible tendency to be very preachy, to put the Christian message before the story. But the story should always be the priority. You should never use your story, if you're writing for the widest possible market, as a megaphone for shouting the Christian message to the world. One of the things I love about The Shepherd as a story is that it's a brilliant story. Forsyth didn't write it in order to promote the Christian faith to his readership, but he did write it in order to captivate them with a great story. And it's beautifully told in 3 acts. Act 1 is the setup, where the RAF pilot in 1957 is at a German airfield and decides to fly across the North Sea back to England in order to get home in time for Christmas. And the takeoff happens, and then there's the inciting incident at the end, towards the end of Act 1, where all of his electrics fail. Then there's Act 2, which is crossing the ocean and getting more and more desperate as more and more systems begin to fail within the aircraft. But then there's the appearance, midpoint of Act 2, always a critical revelatory moment in storytelling, where the shepherd figure appears. The rest of Act 2 is the journey back down to the ground, and then Act 3 is what happens, and I'm not going to share what happens, to this RAF pilot once he starts interacting with the man who runs this old RAF Minton, Norfolk airfield. And that's where the surprise happens. Beautifully told, 3-act structure, just fantastically paced story, very, very well researched, based on Forsyth's own experience as a pilot. So lots of great detail, lots of very convincing systems, talk, etc. within the aircraft. And here is a situation where Frederick Forsyth, the shepherd, teaches us one vital lesson: thou shalt not be preachy. Don't put the message before the story. Always make the story the priority and tell the story for its own sake. Make it as good as possible. Now, the second lesson I think we learn from the shepherd is thou shalt not be contrived. What I mean by contrived, many of the Christian writers who come to me and to Book Lab, they can be a bit contrived, if I'm really honest, in their immature and early stages of the writing craft. They can crowbar the Christian elements of the story into their story, and that can often make those Christian elements feel very unnatural and artificial. Not so with Frederick Forsyth, who brilliantly sets up a situation in his story where the pilot, who has been reliant upon technology in the early part of his flight, and indeed in his entire working life in the RAF, is now forced to recognize the limitations of the scientific, the limitations and restrictions of the technological world, and in his desperation does what any of us, and in fact I think all of us would do, which is turn to prayer. And there's a magnificent prayer in which, in the cockpit, the pilot says, I haven't prayed in a long time. I don't know how to pray, but please, God, get me out of this bloody mess, literal prayer. And it has that sort of natural, raw, realistic vibe to it. It doesn't feel like it's been forced into the story. It's something that we'd all do. Remember that it's, as the saying goes, true that there were no atheists in the trenches. No, there weren't, because people became desperate and therefore they turned back to what they knew as children, which is the power of trusting prayer. So I think with Frederick Forsyth, what you get here is like It's a Wonderful Life, when George Bailey, in his desperation in the bar in Bedford Falls, starts praying, is something that's the opposite of contrived. So thou shalt not be contrived. Forgive me for being rather forceful with that one, but I've seen some contrivance in my time. And the third thing that I want to say is thou shalt not be blatant. You know, one of the things that I love about Jesus' storytelling is that it was never blatant. When he told parables, the message was often very indirect. It was more covert than overt, more indirect than direct. And you had to have eyes to see and ears to hear and a mind and a heart to understand if you were to penetrate beyond the superficial level of the story to the heavenly or spiritual level that lay beneath. And I think there's something of this with Frederick Forsyth's storytelling in The Shepherd. He's not blatant at all. He's not in your face. There's something very indirect, something very covert about the spiritual significance of the story. The story is called The Shepherd. And of course, the shepherd is a known World War II term for pilots who guided lost pilots home, basically rescuers of those who are lost in the air. And this, of course, without Forsyth ever leading the reader, Forsyth leaves it as something the reader needs to work out. This sets up a whole layer of meaning, a whole resonance with the Good Shepherd, John chapter 10, who lays down his life for his sheep, with the shepherd of Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall nothing lack, and he leads me, etc. Even though I may walk through the valley of the shadow of death, his rod and his staff, they will comfort me still, the shepherd who guides us and leads us home, where we will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. All of these sorts of resonances will be in some more discerning readers' minds. And what's brilliant about Forsyth is that he resists the temptation to be blatant and say to you as a reader, look, I've called this novella The Shepherd because I want you to understand that the shepherd pilot in this story is like Jesus, the Good Shepherd. He doesn't do all that stuff, that nonsense that we tend to engage and indulge in as Christian authors. He just leaves it implicit rather than renders it as explicit. So thou shalt not be blatant. The fourth rule, I think, the fourth commandment that the shepherd so brilliantly teaches us is thou shalt not be superficial. There are many layers or levels to this story, and I've already pointed out two. So you've got the literal level of the story of the shepherd, and that is the story of the RAF pilot who gets lost, whose instruments fail, who's in a fog and all at sea, and who's guided home by a figure known in the RAF as a shepherd. That's the literal level. But then there's the spiritual level. I've just identified that for you. I don't need to repeat that. That's about the Good Shepherd. And then thirdly, there is another level entirely, which I'm going to call the allegorical level. And here I think there's something very interesting. The edition that I have of The Shepherd, which is a recently released edition, not only has the story of the shepherd, but also has a preface written by Frederick Forsyth for this edition. And in that preface, which he calls The Outsider, he talks about his life as a writer, talks about himself as an outsider, as somebody who lives a very solitary existence. Now, I, as a writer, as a full-time professional writer, live that same kind of life. Here I am talking to you. It's Tuesday morning, UK time. I will not see anybody today until my wife comes home at about 4 or 5 o'clock. That's in 5 or 6 hours' time. I've got my two dogs here, our two dogs rather, a black Labrador called Bella and a young yellow Labrador puppy called Phoebe. They are my companions throughout the day. I walk them twice so as to clear my head and get some more inspiration for my writing. But I don't meet people. I live a solitary existence. So when Freddie Forsyth talks in the preface about his life as an outsider and his solitary existence as a writer, I can relate to that. I find it very much something I can identify with. But also, I thought to myself, why is he talking like this? Again, he's not being blatant, he's not being in your face, but I think what he's doing is he's making a suggestion in this preface that his life as a writer is a bit like his life as an RAF pilot when he too flew vampire jets. a very lonely, solitary existence. And being a writer, when you're on your own and you're typing away here as I do, trying to write stories for the mass market, trying to do what God has called you to do, sometimes you can feel lonely, you can feel bereft, you can feel a bit at sea, you can feel a little bit of a fog. And in those moments, my experience, and I think this is probably what Freddie Forsyth is trying indirectly to say, is his experience too, is that the shepherd comes to guide our thoughts, to guide our typing, to guide all that we do, so that we can land where Jesus wants us to land, the Good Shepherd, with the project that he's set before us. So my fourth little rule there is thou shalt not be superficial. Multivalence, many values, layers, levels of meaning is what we should be working at. The resonance, the harmony, the complexity, the profundity of a Bach symphony. So that's what I think is important in a Christmas story. And finally, thou shalt not be predictable. When we come to the end of Freddie Forsyth's story, The Shepherd, there's nothing really predictable about it, although once you see it, the twist, the big reveal, you think, oh my gosh. Yes, I'm surprised, but I'm not surprised because the story's been written so beautifully that there are clues all the way through. But I just didn't see them at the time because this is multi-leveled and I've read it at the literal level. I might have had some sort of semblance or idea of the spiritual level, but I didn't see that coming. And I'm not going to tell you what the twist is, but it's in the final sentences of the story. Thou shalt not be predictable. So often Christian authors who come to me and come to Book Lab, there's a predictability about their writing, and we just need to be a little bit more surprising and startling in the content of our storytelling and writing and in the form and delivery of it as well. So those are my 5 thou shalt nots. And I think if we were to observe those commandments from the shepherd, I think we could end up, with God's grace, writing a Christmas story that has the same traction as The Shepherd. You may not know this, but Canada, which is not exactly a Christian country, it's actually quite a secular society. On Christmas Eve, even to this day, The Shepherd is still broadcast on the radio, and many people in the nation, as a matter of cultural tradition, listen to it. And that's an extraordinary thing as a writer, to have written a story with that level of national impact. But secondly, also Disney Plus, who've come in for an awful lot of criticism this year from a lot of people, but they have just released the first filmic version of The Shepherd, starring John Travolta. And it's a short, but it's high on impact, and it's a very, more than, in fact, passable rendition of Freddie Forsyth's famous story. So let's observe those 5 commandments. If we're going to write a Christmas story in the future, if we have an ambition in God to write a great Christmas story that will stand the test of time, just remember those vital lessons from The Shepherd. And if you're interested in reading a Christmas story that I've written, my first ever novel, or novella really, strictly speaking, was called King of Hearts, about a man who walks out on his family on Christmas Eve because he becomes a poker addict. He becomes addicted to gambling, to poker tournaments, and who heads off to the far north to Casino City in order to indulge his addiction. He meets 3 figures who on the way help him towards redemption, an old priest, a homeless girl called Christine, and a wonderful truck driver called Matt. And they are well, I'm not going to tell you what they are representations of symbolically, but you will find out as you read King of Hearts. Let's all try and write great Christmas stories if that's part of our calling, but let's remember the shepherd, and let's involve the shepherd in the process too. So let's write radiantly, let's live luminously, let's keep writing in the light, and if you've enjoyed this, and it's helped you, then please press the subscribe button, hit the like button. And if you're watching this at the run-up or during the run-up to Christmas, then from my wife Cherith and me, my wife Cherith does all the editing for these videos, and from our two dogs, Bella and Phoebe, a very happy Christmas and a very prosperous and productive New Year.